Hi all, welcome to Cyber Warfare Labs AWS Cloud Red Team course. In this module, we will discuss about how we can use Lambda function to get the initial access within the AWS environment. So you can see here in this diagram, suppose there is a Lambda function which have codes which is mentioned there in the Lambda functions, which is used to perform some operations. Now how we can trigger this Lambda functions? Generally we have a API gateway which is publicly exposed, which is allowed to trigger these Lambda functions. Now we know that we have an application which is consume this API gateway and which is used to trigger this Lambda functions. How we can trigger this API gateway? So there is multiple way. Either maybe you have a IoT devices, you have a web application, or you have any other services which is going to consume this API gateway, and the API gateway is used to trigger this Lambda function. So suppose this API gateway is publicly exposed and we can access the API, and we found that there is a vulnerability which is basically web related vulnerability or application related vulnerability there in API, and we exploit this vulnerability to get the initial access. So you can see here I hit this API endpoint, and then the function is invoked there in Lambda function, the code which is mentioned there, and this code will be run on a containers. So this is a runtime Lambda function code which is running on a container, and we get the initial access using this container. So we get the initial access, we can execute whatever command, operating system level command here in these containers. So I will show you how it's look like. So suppose you can see here this is the API. You can copy this. This is the API which is used to which basically this API is consumed in one of the application which is execute the remote code there. So let's copy this one. So you can see here this is the API ID. This is the notations for this API, execute API. This is the reason, this is the URL which you generally use in API. Then this is the stage, so it seems like it's a production stage, and this is the endpoint, and where you found that there is a remote code execution vulnerability in this parameter. And let's see how we can execute this command. So you can see here I am able to execute the command on this containers, So the code, the Lambda code, which is basically serverless or event driven. So when it's triggered, it will be it will create a runtime environment in this container, and you can see here I'm able to execute our remote code there in this particular container. So you can execute whatever command you want to execute. It's basically operating system command. And this Lambda function in AWS generally use a container services to execute the code there. Whenever we trigger the functions, the function will be executed on the container. So you can see here, but these things, this is a publicly exposed, the API gateway, the API which is consumed there, it is publicly exposed, and we found using a manual analysis or any automation tool, we found that there is one parameter which is vulnerable to remote code execution. So you can see it's the Lambda function, the code which is there in the Python programming language, and you are able to execute the remote code there. So you can use whatever command you want to use, and seems like they are running on the Linux. This container basically running on the Linux, and you are able to execute command, whatever command you want to execute. So this is one method you can get the initial access on the AWS environment. Second thing is, suppose you can execute the command there, but there is one way. Generally in AWS Lambda functions, they have a secrets, API key as well as secrets there in environment variables. So if you extract the environment variable, you can use these secrets ID as well as secrets to configure your CLI, and then you can access the AWS accounts. or other services which is related to this account. So let's see. So this command is basically the same command here. What we are going to do, we are going to execute the environment command. So basically it will extract all environment variable which is there. So like from the first, you can execute the remote code, and you can take the reverse shell, and you can execute the whatever operation you want to perform. In second case, what we are going to do, we are going to retrieve the AWS secret as well as secrets ID as well as secrets, so we can configure our CLI to access other services. Both are the method we can use to getting the initial access in AWS account, and we are compromising the AWS Lambda services to getting the initial access. So you can see here, if I execute here in environment env, and you can see here I'm able to exfiltrate. This is the information you can see here. This is the access key ID, AWS access key ID, and this is the AWS secret. So you can configure it. Let's see how we can configure it. So you can basically you can configure this in your profile or in your AWS CLI, and you can get the initial access on AWS accounts. If these functions have the higher rights or more privilege in AWS account, or whatever service the privilege this function have, you can get the same privilege. So this is how you can get the initial access on AWS account by compromising Lambda functions. So let's see how we can configure this one. New one. Let's see if there is any token which is already configured. Okay, you can see there is no token is configured here. Now what I'm going to do, I'm configuring this one. So let's export. What we are going to do, access key ID is this one. So let's copy this one. Let's export AWS access secret key. This is the secret key. And now what we are going to export, we are going to export a temporary token. This is the AWS session token. You can copy this one and you can paste it here. Now let's try to access the same get caller identity, and let's see, you have the same role which is mapped to this AWS Lambda function. So this is how you can get the initial access via two methods. One is you can perform the remote code execution there, and you can take the reverse shell. Second one is you can execute or you can retrieve the environment variable. In environment variables, they have a secret which is basically a key to access the AWS accounts, and it's depend what rights does application have or what role is assigned to this AWS Lambda function. You will get the same role or same rights in AWS services. But this is a method you can compromise AWS Lambda functions to getting the initial access. So that's all for this video. Thank you so much.